Yes, hello everyone. I hope connection will be great and you can see me and hear me. So I'm Alex Zhukovich, and today I will talk about efficient UI testing. So let's imagine that we have a startup, and this startup is on early stage. And this startup is working on the application which help to monitor emotional state of any person. Every person can add multiple emotional state during the day, later on can see this data, can see it in a graph, etc., etc. And this startup just hired a developer, and one of the first tasks after meeting with all people, speaking vision of the company, etc., was about exploring possibility to integrate test automation. Even if startup is an early stage, they think maybe it can be helpful. So initially when our new developer just explored the app, he saw, why do we even need it? We have just a couple of screens, we can test them manually in just during a couple of minutes. So maybe we don't need to spend right now a lot of time and effort just to integrate in it. But anyway, he decided to speak with a person who verifies the application before releasing first alpha. So, and here he figured out that that application, even if it has a couple of screens, has a couple of hidden features and hidden requirements. And one of them is that application should looks good on different type with different font sizes, because we all know that our application should be accessible. We all know that we have some basic accessibility options, and font size is one of them. And of course, we want to be sure that our application looks perfectly on different devices with different font sizes. In addition to it, we have couple of color theme, like a light color theme and dark. If the company plans to create more, of course, it also will be great to test them. And of course, in a plan, the startup has a requirement to add multiple languages. So as you can see, even one screen already grow a lot. It should be tested with many different devices. It should be tested with different font sizes, color scheme, different languages. So initially, our developers saw, okay, it's like 15-20 minutes just to check the app, to check that everything works perfectly. But right now, he figured out that it's a lot of time which developer and QA should spend for verifying different aspects of the application. Because here we have just one screen, but in practice, we will have more and more of them, and amount of feature also will grow. So he decided to explore the application. Because it's one of the first tasks, he wasn't sure how the application was built. And after reading a couple of articles, he figured out that it may have impact of testing the application. Because even in building UI, we have a couple of different options. Initially, everything was simple because we had just activities. And every screen is activity, so everything was clear. Later on, fragment was introduced. And starting from this moment, interesting things start happening, because we didn't have good guidance, so many people just ignore the fragment and still use activities. Some people decided to try fragment and had one activity and multiple fragments, and some people have different opinion. At this point, even right now, we have project which has activities and fragments, sometimes only one activity, multiple fragments, sometimes multiple activity and multiple fragments. And recently, Jetpack Compose was introduced. And Jetpack Compose, it's even something even more interesting than a fragment, because composable functions can be a simple button, or can be group of UI components, or it can be screen or multiple screen, especially if you use navigation. So Composable function can be everything except an activity. Activity is still an entry point to the application. So we have a lot of different options. How can we test each of them? Because it's really hard to do automation without understanding how can we test them and which possibilities do we have. So when we have activity and we want to launch this activity, one of option here is to use activity scenario.launch, when we can put our activity. If we want, we can put some parameters. We can even move to different state of our activity. So it looks good. What about fragments? So with fragments, we can launch fragment in container. So we can put our fragment in some container. We can define initial state. We can define theme attributes. We can put some bundle for this fragment, and we can move to specific activity. And right now, the main question, how it will be launched internally, because we all know that activity is an entry point. And if you want to run something, it always should be passed through. It always should be passed through activity. So internally, our fragment will be added to activity. And this activity during compilation will be added to Android manifest. And initially, our fragment will be added to empty fragment activity. And starting from this moment, we can test it. And right now, Jetpack Compose. Jetpack Compose has a couple of rules. And one of them is create compose rule. It's create an instance of compose content test rule object. And here we can set our content. It can be any composable functions, can be just UI component, can be screen, can be navigation with multiple screens. And during compilation, our component activity will be added to Android manifest. Initially, component activity will be added, and our composable functions will be added to this component activity. So our team didn't have a lot of experience with UI automation. That's why this whole exploration was needed. So later on, they decided to start with the most obvious approach which can be applied initially for testing. So it's end-to-end testing. So what is end-to-end testing? End-to-end testing, it's usually simulation of user behavior. End-to-end test use real environment, real backend, real database, real services, etc. And if we take a look at our application, when we started for the first time, we have no data. Later on, we can add some data. And initially, we can see our emotional state. That person is reading at specific time with specific emotional state. But what we should remember for any type of test, that state before and after test case, I mean state of application, state of environment, etc., should be similar. So we need to do one more additional step, and this step is remove data which we previously added, because we don't want to have a situation that after some test you run the app and you see unexpected data in your app, and of course it can be a reason why all your tests can start failing, and you can have some flakiness after it. So we should clean up all data. Let's take a look at another really popular scenario. So we want to check create account functionality. But initially, we want to navigate to create account functionality. So if we take a look at our code base, we can see that first of all, we click on the settings screen, on the setting text. Later on, we click on the profile. Later on, we click on create account. And right now we're on create account screen. And when we click on create account, we can see that we see expected error on the screen. The main problem of testing this with end-to-end testing is that we spent a lot of time just for navigation. For this specific scenario, we spent we spent around 3 seconds just for navigation, just for navigating from one screen to another. So during the 3 seconds, we are from today's screen, go to the settings screen, from the settings screen to profile, and from profile to create account. And of course, we don't want to spend a lot of time just for navigation without checking anything. So if we try to sum up our experience with end-to-end testing, what we should remember is that entry point of end-to-end test, it's always home screen or splash screen. If we have interaction with server, we will interact with real server. And from one side, it's good because we check that our interaction with real server work properly. We can spend a lot of time for navigation because we always start up from the very beginning. And the main idea of end-to-end test is slow verification of the application. How app work with different services, how app work with real backend, etc. And this approach is good, but it has a lot of limitations. And one of such limitations is to verify all error cases through UI. Because when your backend always returns you success, it's not easy to verify how your app will look like and which data it will receive, which error it will show if it's returning an error, because your backend always returns you a good result. So, and here we have a functional test. And if we come back to previous scenarios, when we wanted to check create account, but with functional test, we can do it much faster, because with functional test, we can test our screen in isolation if your architecture allows you to do it. Because if you cannot launch specific fragment or specific composable functions because of limitation of your application architecture, it can be tricky to use it. But if we can use it, so we can start straightforward from create account screen, just click on create account and verify the error. As you can see, it's much faster. We save 3 seconds, which we spent in previous tests just for navigation. So we can add much more such tests because they are much faster. With this approach, we can easily test different state of the application. As example, when we have no data, when we have some data, when we have loading screen, we can easily test all error cases. Because if we come back to previous one, as you can see here, we use our dependency injection framework. And let's say if you have use cases or repository, you can provide fake or mock for one of layers and just really easy emulate the specific state of the screen. So just to sum up, functional test, entry point of functional test can be any screen if your application allows you to do it. Usually in functional test, we don't use interaction with real server because the interaction with real server is not important for such type of test. In such type of test, we want to be sure that our user interface or our UI component react properly on such specific data. Usually we don't need to spend time on any navigation. And main idea of functional test here is to fast verification component and the screen and how they react on specific data. But after all of it, we still can have a problem. And this problem is if position of any UI element will change, our test wouldn't notify us about it. Because what we check with end-to-end test, what we check with functional test, we check only one thing, is that some component or some text available on the screen. We don't check the position, where it's placed, is it in proper place or not. So, and screenshot test help us to solve this problem. But before speaking about screenshot test, whole test in your application can be split into interaction test and pixel perfectness test. Interaction test is test where you interact with view. You click on different buttons. You're not interested about pixel perfectness. You're interested about flow, how it's work, that it reacts properly on user actions. And with pixel perfectness, we want to be sure that our user interface looks good. Because if we take a look at this example and we try to write interaction test for it, let's say I want to see a username on the screen. I see it in both cases, and I want to see email on the screen. We also see it in both cases, but in practice we have some issue. So ideally, we want to be notified by our user by our test cases that we have some issue on the screen, and of course we don't want to push such PR to the production. If we will notify about our test, we can handle it and fix it before release or before merging any changes. So what can be tested with screenshot test? With screenshot test, we can test any UI components, default or custom one, it's not a problem. And we can test, let's say, color schemes of different applications. So let's take a look at an example. This is our calendar view, which we use in our app. And this calendar view can have two different states. The first one is when current day is today. And the second state that selected day is not current day. So we can see screenshot for it. Let's try to write test cases for it. So one of the most important part when we talk about screenshot test or any other type of test, it should use similar data every time, especially when we talk about screenshot test. Because when data will be different, all your screenshot tests will fail just because UI of your app looks differently. And the main idea of screenshot test in general is that we have our screenshot in a project, and when we run the app after any changes, we don't use screenshots and we compare them with already existing one. If they're similar to existing one, that's great. If they're different, because we added some changes, we change color, we change font size, or we do any changes, our test will notify us about it, and we can avoid any visual regression. So initially, we created our test date. So for all tests, we will use the same date. So we already removed the flakiness problem because we always use the same date. And later on, we just create at our composable function, and at the end, call function compare screenshots. This is example use the shot library for screenshot testing. It's, I would say, one of the most popular libraries. The other one is Paparazzi, but we will talk a bit more later on about some differences in these libraries. So right now we cover a lot of different approaches which we added to our project, which you can add to your project. And let's try to combine them efficiently. Or maybe we don't need some of them, and we can test everything perfectly without it and even maybe save some time. So let's take a look. What we do, we combine end-to-end test, functional test, and screenshot test. But maybe initially, let's try to remove any of these layers, any of these approaches for our test. So the first one, let's try to remove end-to-end test. And we can see we can have only functional test and screenshot test. So functional test can use mock data and check mock or fake data and check everything into the app. And we already will have some, it already will be great. With screenshot test, we can check pixel perfectness. But the main problem here is that we don't verify interaction with real server. It means that we can test one version of the backend or fake data from one version of the backend. But after some changes, some fields can be removed from the response. And when you will get real data from real server, you will have a crash just because it's a new data. So it's not really a good idea to remove end-to-end tests. The next one, what we try to remove, is functional test. So with functional test, without functional test, we will have only end-to-end test and screenshot test. So in this case, we can check a real interaction with server, real interaction with environment, etc. In addition to it, we can use pixel perfectness. The main problem of this approach is that it will be really complicated to verify some cases, like some error cases, because backend returns you success for your user. You can create multiple users, you can do a lot of magic, but still it will be slow because you always start your app from the very beginning, not from required screen. So it's possible with some limitations, but it wouldn't be efficient. And the last one, we try to remove pixel perfectness. And with end-to-end test and functional test, we can cover everything perfectly without pixel perfectness. So still you can have some visual regressions into your code after any changes or before release. So ideally, we cannot really remove any of this type of tests. And my experience recommend you to have just a small percent of end-to-end test and later on big percent of screenshot test and a bit smaller of functional test. Because usually design is one of the most important topic of the application. So it will be great if your application will work perfectly without any visual regression. And of course, checking different state of all screen is also important. And you need just small percent of test just to cover interaction with real backend, interaction with real services, with database, etc., etc. And right now, I want to share takeaways which we figure out when we covered our application and help our startup during migration, during introducing to automation. So when you build more and more test cases, you will see that readability of test cases is one of really important topic. So let's take a look at this example. Here I use just Compose UI test library. It's the most, I would say, shortest one because you have just few methods. Usually when you use Espresso, you should call much more methods and your code is much longer. But even here, we have a profile screen, we have a login screen, and we come back to profile screen one more time. So when you read this test, you can understand, find node with text, click on it, enter text to email, enter text to password, click to login, and later on verify something. So it's clear, but without screenshots, you don't really understand on which screen you are right now, and it's not so easy to understand. And of course, the simplest way how it can be solved and it can be a bit more cleaner, it's a comments. The bad thing about comments is that they are super fast, will be outdated. And you cannot really force people to fix them because it's really easy to forget to update the comment or to remove the comments, etc. So it's not so good solution. What is much better solution is to use a page object design patterns, have different variations of it. One of them is pretty popular in mobile testing community. It's a screen robot pattern, and here we split all functionalities between different screens. And the good thing that, let's say our login screen has login functions, but if you try to call it on profile screen, you will have an error. So in this case, first of all, it's much more readable. And secondly, every screen has some functionalities for testing specific behavior for the screen or do specific interaction for the screen. The next point is flakiness and flaky test. When you start adding a lot of them, when you don't have a lot of experience, you can easily have a lot of flaky tests. Let's take a look at main groups of flaky tests, why we have them, and what is the reason. So we have 4 groups. One is external dependency, framework issues, test case itself, and device and emulator. So let's start with external dependency. So first of all, it can be backend. Secondly, we can have different speeds. And if we expect that we get response during 1 second and we get response during 2 seconds, we will have an issue. Plus, we can have different security layers on top, like a VPN, some certificate, etc., etc. Or your data center just can have some issue or with different resources, or your backend just didn't respond because it's crashed or something like this. And in this case, it's not a problem of a test case, but problem of environment. If we will combine end-to-end test, functional test, and screenshot test, only end-to-end test will fail. All other stuff will check everything because just end-to-end test use external dependency. Later on, we can have a framework issues. Every framework very often get updates with fixing some issues, adding some functionalities, etc. Plus, we can have problem with components which not always displayed on the screen. As example, toast, snack bar, some maybe custom views, which appear for some period of time and later on disappear. And if you will try to check them when they already disappear, of course you will fail it. So here it's possible that can be some timing issue. When we talk about device and emulator, it can be a problem with performance, maybe out of memory on our device. We also can have a situation, especially when it's not emulator but real phone, which you use also for as your own phone. You can start testing up later on, notification pop up and overlap some UI elements on the screen. And in this case, it also can be error. It's not always happened. It's not often happened because we usually use some continuous integration, which has completely different devices, not our own, but it still can happen. And when we talk about test case itself, first of all, it can be issue when we simulate user action. Especially it can be problem when you use end-to-end test and all tests use the same account. And one person just decided to change the password for this account. So it will start immediately fail for all users. Just because some external dependency was changed and it's not synced with test case itself. We can easily have a situation when we can have incorrect state before and after test case. And one of such reason, let's say during test case, you enable just airplane mode. And next test, try to fetch some data, but airplane mode, no internet. So it's also possible. So this is important. If you change something during the test, just revert these changes at the end of the test. And yeah, as I shared before, we can have some problem with toast, snack bar, custom view, which not always available on the screen. So try to think more what you are doing. If you change something, just revert it. If you have some backend, try not to use it in all of tests because some of them may be not needed. The next takeaway is learn your tools. And here, one of example is comparing between Shot and Paparazzi library. Both of this library are good. Both of this library has pretty often release. One of the big difference between them is that Shot require device because it's instrumentation test, and Paparazzi use JVM, and it uses the same library for rendering as used inside Android Studio for doing previews. So in my personal experience, I had sometimes problems that Android Studio cannot render my screen. Sometimes it's too complicated. Sometimes it's just rendering issue of this library. And I want to show one simple example. So it's material edit field. And as you can see, with shot, it was rendered properly. But with paparazzi, we can see some issue here in rendering because our label text just overlap with the whole border. It's small issue. Paparazzi is still great library. It's faster than a shot, but it has some limitations. It uses external library from Google for rendering. And sometimes we can have such issue. If you're fine with it, and speed is much more important for you, because anyway, during manual testing, it will be covered, that's great. If you prefer not have such issue, Shot is also great libraries. Many companies use it without any issue. And the next really cool thing, which can save a lot of time, which can save a lot of code, it's parameterized test. Because with parameterized test, we can not write a lot of tests, we can handle it in one. So before speaking about parameterized test, I want to share two small libraries which can be very helpful for parameterized test. And the first one is Android UI testing utils. This is a small library which allows you to run your fragment, your activity, your composable functions inside the fragment, which already has predefined locale, light and dark mode, different font sizes, screen orientation, and display size. And the next library which is needed for parameterized test is test parameter injector. You can use alternative libraries. But anyway, you should use any library which allows you to inject some data into your test case. And let's take a look at parameterized test. So here we have some test case. We can add two parameters, or we can extract them and use as a field. Then all tests will have access to this data. So, and here we pass font size from enum and UI mode from enum. Font size has 4 value: smaller, small default, large, and largest. And UI mode has light and dark mode. So, and later on, we put this data into our activity scenario configurator. To fonts, we apply font size and UI mode. And later on, what is really important, when you do screenshots, you need to pass this parameter also to name of screenshots, because you don't want to have a situation that screenshot name is the same and one screenshot override previous one. And anyway, you will receive just one instead of multiple of them. When we run this test will automatically create 8 screenshot tests just for a single test. If we want to check different font sizes in combination with different color theme, it's a really great tool which can save you a lot of time. You don't need to write similar test case again and again and again, just changing font size or your color theme. So parameterized test here is amazing too. And just small reminder, we use a lot of different approaches which help us to achieve efficiency. So first of all, let's imagine you get some data from your database. And in this data, first of all, you get some data from the server, and later on you fetch it, download data from the server, cache it in database, and display data from database to the user. So we can pre-populate our database, and we can do it with multiple different ways. So first of all, we can just use query, SQL query, to pre-populate our database. If we have access to, let's say, a repository, we can do it via repository. We can also do it via user interface. Let's imagine to-do list app. We can click add node and add some node. And if we want to add multiple of them, and we try to do it with UI interaction, just clicking on different UI component, filling text, etc., it will be super long and super inefficient. So here we can just use query or dependencies. If we want to pre-populate our database, we don't need to use UI interaction. So we can also use real data and fake data. And we can, so here we can have three different options. First of all, we have only production server. This is all. The second one, we use production server and development server. And the third one, we can also use the mock or fake data. So what we can see here is, let's try to see at benefits and maybe some issues using a production and development server. The benefit, of course, that we use production backend. So it's amazing because it's always the latest version, and we use it, and we know that our app works perfectly with latest backend and latest services. When we use production and dev server, we should remember that we need to sync data between them. If we install updated version of the backend to the production server, we should do the same for the development server. And it can be some tricky stuff, especially when your production and dev server requires some VPN, some certificates, and you use different certificates. So it can be a bit more tricky to handle everything inside the app, but you can use different product flavor or feature toggles, and it will be handled. And when we talk about mock and fake data, the great thing is that we don't have internet connection. We don't need internet connection. We use just fake data, but the downside is that we don't have internet connection because we miss some data synchronization between a real backend and mock. So in some cases, it's good to use, but not always. And of course, it makes data more stable because when you use fake data, you get response just right now. You don't need to wait until you get data from the backend. You're not dependent from the network connection. You're not dependent from the problem with your backend. You just get it right now. So in some cases, fake data is really great too. And just to compare, end-to-end test always start from the very beginning. Functional can start from any screen if your architecture allows you to it. End-to-end test usually use interaction with real database, real server, real multiple servers if you have them. In end-to-end test, you can waste a lot of time for navigation, especially if screens what you want to test, it's not the first one. With functional test, you can run it from any screen. And main idea of end-to-end test, it's application verification, how it's work with all dependencies. When we talk about functional test, it's UI verification of screen and UI component. So if we combine them and add screenshot test, it will be much faster and much more efficient. And of course, in our app, we introduce all of these techniques. It gave a lot of benefits for us. Right now, we spend less time for testing, for manual testing, and we can be sure that after our changes, everything still works. If not, we will be notified about it. If we have some visual changes, we will notify by our test about it. So in this case, it's really great that we added that. But of course, it's not perfect. We want to add couple of new features to our approach. We want to add possibility to group our test cases to speed up local development. If you work on some features, you sometimes don't want to run all tests, you want to run tests specific for this feature. We also plan to add testing widget and shortcuts, so it will be great to test stuff also outside of the application, not only inside the app. This is all from my side. I hope it was helpful. If you have any questions, I will be too happy to answer all of them. Yes, if you have questions, you can later on just send me a message to Slack, and I will be happy to answer in Slack.